In 1823, one of the wealthiest men in the Russian Empire stopped obeying the Tsar. He refused to swear allegiance. He wore a beard when beards had been abolished. He kept a medieval battle standard, the banner of Prince Pozharsky, hidden in his estate south of Moscow. He had a private army, a fortress with working artillery, and a secret society he called the Order of Russian Knights. His name was Count Matvey Dmitriev Mamonov, and he was a direct descendant of Rurik, the founder of the original Russian dynasty, whose bloodline predated the Romanovs by 7 centuries. They didn't arrest him. They didn't try him. They didn't exile him to Siberia. They declared him insane. He spent the next 40 years inside his estate under military guard. No trial, no charges, no appeal. Just a signature on a medical certificate from court physicians, and the man was gone. Legally, politically, socially, gone. When he left the world in 1863, the file was closed and the case was forgotten. Historians occasionally mention him as an eccentric nobleman. Almost no one asks the obvious question. If the man was simply ill, why did it take the personal authorization of 2 successive emperors to keep him locked up? Standard commitment proceedings in the Russian Empire required a local magistrate and a physician. Mamonov required Alexander I and then Nicholas I. 2 separate imperial decrees, 2 separate sets of court physicians who examined him and found, each time, that confinement must continue. For 40 years. His estate, Mamonova Dacha on the Sparrow Hills outside Moscow, remained under military guard until his last day. Not hospital orderlies, soldiers, armed, stationed at perimeter, under orders. For a sick old man who, by the final decades, could barely walk. That is not a medical file. That is a state secret in a medical costume. Here is something worth checking. Before 1775, Russia did not have a single state psychiatric institution. Not one. The mentally ill were kept in monastery cellars, in private homes, or simply released into the streets. The Orthodox Church handled them. The state had no jurisdiction over minds. Then, in November of 1775, 8 months after Pugachev's head was displayed on a pike in Moscow's main square, Catherine II signed the most sweeping administrative reform in Russian imperial history. The empire was divided into 50 provinces. New courts were created. New police structures were established. And buried in the middle of the document, almost as a footnote, was a new institution, the prikaz of public charity. Every province was required to build one. Their listed functions were schools, hospitals, orphanages, and the containment of the insane. By 1800, 40 of these institutions existed across the empire. From 0 to 40 in 25 years. Think about what that pace means in an era before telegraph, before railways, before standardized construction. Building one such institution required local stone, local labor, provincial budgets, architectural plans, appointed overseers. The logistics alone should have stretched any administration to its limits. In the surviving provincial reports, this network appears with striking consistency and unusually little visible friction. Buildings of that scale, in that era, did not normally rise cleanly across an entire continent. They stalled. Stone ran short. labor scattered at harvest. Money waited on decisions made 1,000 kilometers away. Provincial Russia in the 1780s was not a place where parallel construction projects moved without incident. And yet, the Prikaz network moved as if delay had already been priced out of the plan. In the same period, the empire was building roads, expanding the military, managing the aftermath of a war with the Ottomans, and absorbing 3 partitions of Poland. Its administrative apparatus was under extreme strain by any historical measure. And yet, the psychiatric network proceeded without the kind of grinding friction that defined almost every other major construction program of the same era. The closest precedent for that kind of synchronized rollout was the network of military fortifications built under Peter I, a grid of control laid across territory he had just conquered. Nobody argues Peter built that for humanitarian reasons. Now look at who actually wrote the blueprint. Gerhard Friedrich Miller was the empire's chief historiographer. He led the academic expedition to Siberia in the 1740s, the most comprehensive survey of eastern territories in Russian history. He spent 11 years there. He returned with thousands of documents from Siberian archives. Many of those archives, after his visit, were never seen again by independent scholars. Miller was also the man who destroyed Mikhail Lomonosov's career. Lomonosov, Russia's most prominent native-born scholar, argued that the foundations of Russian statehood were Slavic in origin. Miller countered with the Norman theory, the idea that the original Russian rulers came from Scandinavia, that the Russian state was essentially a foreign import. This was not a neutral academic debate. If the Norman theory was correct, it meant the current foreign-born dynasty sat on a throne that was always meant for foreigners. Perfect. In 1762, 13 years before Catherine's reform, Miller submitted a proposal to the Senate. He called it a plan for houses for the mad. His central innovation was not medical, it was economic. The insane, he argued, should be made to work in textile factories, producing silk and wool for state profit. The institution would be self-financing. Read that again carefully. The man designing Russia's first psychiatric system was not thinking about therapy, diagnosis, or recovery. He was thinking about silk production. The confined would work, the state would profit, the institution would sustain itself. The same extractive logic applied to serfs, to convicts, to any population the empire needed to hold without a criminal charge. When Catherine's reform finally built the network in 1775, it adopted Miller's framework almost exactly. The Prikaz institutions were expected to generate income from patient labor. The categories of person they were to contain, the mad, the disorderly, the unmanageable, were defined loosely enough to include nearly anyone a provincial governor wished to submit for containment. The man who spent a decade deciding which Siberian documents were historically legitimate and which were not, the same man who erased entire eastern territories from the academic record, also designed the system for locking up people who experienced the world differently from the official version. That is not a coincidence of biography. It is a concentration of functions that should never have belonged to one man. Open the Academic Atlas of Russia from 1745. It is the first state-sponsored cartographic atlas in Russian history, produced by the Academy of Sciences, the same institution Miller led. On its general map of the empire, you will find a label covering a vast swath of territory east of the Ural Mountains and stretching across Central Asia. The label reads Tartaria Moskovskaya, Muscovite Tartaria. This is not a foreign name imposed by outside observers. This is Russia's own official academic atlas using this term for Russian state territory. It is not a footnote or a marginal annotation. It is the primary label for an enormous region. Now open the Imperial Atlas from 1792, 47 years later. Search for that name. It is not there, anywhere. In its place, 42 provincial units with administrative names. Tobolsk Governorate, Irkutsk Governorate, Kolivan Governorate. Clean, uniform, bureaucratic. Every one of them created by the same reform of 1775 that also built the psychiatric network. One generation, one administrative act. A territory the size of a continent. Renamed, redrawn, reclassified. And the people who lived through both atlases, who remembered one name and were being told another, what happened to them? There is a standard reading. Cartography improved, terminology evolved, and old names gave way to precise administrative designations. But the term Tartaria Moskovskaya was not a foreign-derived exonym imposed by outside observers. It was generated internally by the Russian Academy of Sciences for Russian state territory. Retiring it required a deliberate institutional decision, not linguistic evolution. Someone signed a paper. Someone removed a word from official use. And they did it in the same decade they built the first institutions for people who might insist on using the old words. There is also the question of what happened to the administrative archives of the territories named in the 1745 Atlas. Provincial records from Siberian voivodeships before the reform of 1775 are extraordinarily sparse. Far sparser than the records from equivalent periods in European Russia. This is unusual. Siberian towns of the early 18th century were active trading posts, with customs records, census records, land dispute records. Those records should exist in some form. Many do not. The gaps are consistent with a systematic review, not with ordinary archival decay. Wood rots, parchment foxes, but it does not vanish uniformly across an entire region unless someone removed it uniformly. In 1783, Catherine did not merely commission a history of Russia. She entered the project as its editor. A decree in December of that year established a commission for the compilation of notes on ancient history, primarily Russian. Count Shuvalov led it on paper. In practice, the surviving manuscripts carry Catherine's personal annotations, sections struck through, framings inserted, entire passages rewritten in her hand. This was not oversight. This was authorship. Here is what makes this architecturally interesting. The commission was established in 1783. The psychiatric network was funded and expanding through the 1780s. The new atlas, Erasing Tartaria, would be published in 1792. These are not three separate projects. They are three departments of one operation. The commission told officials what was true history. The atlas told administrators what was true geography. The prikaz told everyone what was a true state of mind. If you remembered Tartaria, you were confused about geography. If you cited old chronicles the commission hadn't approved, you were confused about history. And if you were confused about both, there was now a well-funded institution available to help you. 3 departments, 1 operation. No conspiracy required, only synchronized institutions reading from the same mandate. The most chilling detail: the commission contained no professional historians by contemporary standards. It contained trusted courtiers. The only scholarly authority involved was the Academy of Sciences, the same body that had already eliminated Tartaria from the official map. The commission's working method involved not just selection, but substitution. When a chronicle contained references to independent territorial powers in the East, the commission did not simply remove those passages. It found alternative manuscript copies that happened not to contain the problematic sections, and elevated those copies as more authoritative. The originals were not destroyed in most cases. They were reclassified, marked as corrupted, interpolated, unreliable, filed at the back of the archive. The intellectual machinery for calling a document insane preceded the physical machinery for calling a person insane by about a decade. The first psychiatric facility in St. Petersburg opened in 1779. It was called Obukhovskaya Hospital. It was built on the embankment of the Fontanka River, on land that had previously been the estate of Artemy Volinsky. Volinsky was executed in 1740. His crime? Organizing resistance against foreign influence at the imperial court. He was accused of attempting to place Russian-born officials in positions held by Germans and Balts. The charge, essentially, was that he wanted Russia to be run by Russians. The land was confiscated. The estate was demolished. And 39 years later, on that same ground, the empire built its first institution for the containment of mines. The state needed land near water for sanitary infrastructure. Volinsky's former estate was available. Crown property on the Fontanka. Architect Quarengi was commissioned. The building went up in classical style, and the institution began functioning. The problem with that reading is Quarengi's own design. His other projects in Petersburg, the Hermitage Theater, the Smolny Institute, share recognizable features. Generous windows, open colonnades, rooms designed for human presence. The stone building he completed on the Fontanka in 1784 shares almost none of those features. Long, narrow corridors, windows positioned high on the exterior walls, narrow as arrow slits at the lower levels. A compartmentalized ward structure with no sightlines between sections. Those are not the features of a treatment facility. They are the features of a building designed to hold people who should not be able to see each other. The first patients were admitted to wooden barracks before the stone building was complete. The patient lists from those first 5 years remain closed to independent researchers. We know how many beds there were. 60, including the psychiatric ward. We do not know who occupied them. Moscow's psychiatric system has a different origin story, and a more direct one. After the suppression of Pugachev's uprising, the secret expedition, the empire's political police, directed personally by Stepan Shishkovsky, occupied a compound on Myasnitskaya Street. This was where Pugachev himself was held before his execution. This was where his lieutenants were interrogated. This was the machinery of ideological enforcement in its most physical form. Stone walls, iron doors, men whose professional function was to extract confessions. By the 1780s, with the uprising crushed and the immediate security crisis past, the facility needed a new function. Officially, it was repurposed due to a shortage of suitable buildings in Moscow. The insane were moved in. Think about the logic of that transition. The same rooms, the same walls, the same isolation systems, now rebranded as medical care. The staff changed, but the architecture did not. The chains remained. The absence of windows remained. The complete separation from the outside world remained. The only thing that changed was the paperwork. Where it once said prisoner of the secret expedition, it now said patient of the charitable institution. There is a word for a facility that holds people against their will, isolates them completely, applies physical restraints, and generates no treatment records, only containment records. In the 18th century, that word was dungeon. After 1775, it became hospital. The official history of Russian psychiatry acknowledges this transition. It presents it as an improvised response to infrastructure shortages. Moscow, after the plague years of the 1770s, was short on suitable stone buildings. That's plausible as far as it goes. What it does not explain is the direction of the transition. If the need was genuinely medical, why move patients into a torture chamber foundation rather than converting any other available stone building in the city? The Moscow institution eventually moved to the Preobrazhenskoye district, where it still functions today. It is named after a 19th century psychiatrist, which neatly erases the memory of its origin. Most visitors have no idea they are standing on the institutional successor of the chambers where Pugachev's men were broken. Ivan Yakovlevich was brought to the Moscow asylum in 1821. He had been a seminary student. He had walked into a river in winter as a form of spiritual discipline, was pulled out, and was subsequently committed on grounds of religious mania. He was 34 years old. He would not leave the building for the next 44 years. What made his case extraordinary was not his confinement. Many people were confined. It was what happened next. The hospital administration began charging visitors for access to his cell. Muscovites came in crowds. Merchants, aristocrats, clergy, students. They asked him questions. He answered in riddles and verse. He called himself a student of cool waters. His pronouncements were recorded, copied, sold as pamphlets. His cell became a paying attraction. The obvious question is why? If this man was simply ill, if his words were meaningless noise produced by a damaged mind, why did the institution monetize access to him? Why not simply contain him quietly, as they contained everyone else? The less obvious answer is that his words were not treated as meaningless by the people who heard them. They were treated as encoded. He spoke of old things, old orders, old arrangements. People came because they felt he remembered something they had forgotten. The institution's response was not to stop this. It was to profit from it, while simultaneously framing it as spectacle. The voice of memory, presented as the voice of madness, sold by the hour. There is a detail about his confinement that does not appear in the official hospital histories. The room where Ivan Yakovlevich was kept was not a medical ward in any recognizable sense. It had no bed for much of his first decade. He slept on the floor, sometimes on bare stone. The institution collected admission fees from visitors, but appears not to have spent those fees on his basic conditions. Contemporaries who visited him, including several prominent Moscow intellectuals, described the cell as closer to a pit than a room. The institution defended this by explaining that he preferred these conditions, that he had requested them, that this was part of his spiritual discipline. Perhaps it was. Or perhaps a man who had spent 20 years confined in substandard conditions had simply adapted his preferences to his available options, and the institution found it convenient to call adaptation theology. He left the world in 1861. His grave still exists in Moscow. The pamphlets of his sayings were popular through the entire 19th century. Not one of them has ever been systematically analyzed for the historical content embedded in his metaphors. That analysis has never been commissioned. It has never been funded. 44 years. Paid admission. No treatment notes. No discharge plan. No inquiry. The absence of those records is not an oversight. Institutions keep records of what they consider worth recording. Here is the mechanism in its simplest form. First, you redraw the map. The territory that had its own name, its own administrative identity recorded in the state's own atlas, is broken into uniform provinces. Each province is small enough that no single official can remember the full shape of what came before. The new names are administrative, not historical. They encode no memory. Second, you rewrite the chronicle. A commission with imperial authority determines which old texts are authoritative and which are confused or corrupted. The criteria for this determination are never made explicit, but the results are consistent. Texts that reference the old territorial arrangements are marginalized. Texts that support the continuity of the current dynasty are elevated. Third, you build the infrastructure. If someone insists on the old map, if a merchant tries to claim rights under old territorial law, if a priest cites a chronicle the commission has not approved, if a nobleman publicly questions the dynasty's legitimacy, there is now a mechanism. Not a trial, not an exile that creates a martyr, a medical certificate, a transfer to a charitable institution. A man who was a political problem becomes a man who is simply unwell. The most elegant feature of this system is that it cannot be directly refuted. A prisoner can argue his innocence. A martyr inspires followers. A madman only generates pity, or, in Ivan Yakovlevich's case, revenue. What remains provable is the timing, the clustering, the synchronization of institutions that had no operational reason to align if their purpose was purely humanitarian. The reform of 1775 that created the psychiatric network. The commission of 1783 that rewrote the chronicles. The atlas of 1792 that erased the old geography. The case of Mamonov in 1823. A Rurikid noble whose specific symptoms of madness included wearing old Russian dress, venerating pre-Petrine symbols, and refusing to recognize Romanov legitimacy. Each of these can be explained individually. Together, they form a pattern with a very specific shape. Work through what the official framing actually asks you to hold simultaneously. The Russian Empire, immediately after its most severe internal uprising in 2 centuries, spontaneously decided to build a continent-spanning network of humanitarian institutions, while simultaneously undertaking a comprehensive review of its historical chronicles, while redrawing its administrative map from scratch, while reforming its cartographic standards. All of this in the same 15-year window, all moving in the same direction, all converging on the same outcome: a cleaner, more unified, more administrable empire in which the old territorial vocabulary had no functional place. Then hold the case of Mamonov alongside that. A man with a private fortress, an organized political society, a coherent constitutional program based on ancient dynastic claims. He became ill in exactly the years his political opposition reached its peak. His illness expressed itself specifically as loyalty to pre-Romanov symbols. The timing is unfortunate. The specificity of the symptoms is harder to dismiss. The standard explanation for Mamonov is neurological decay, possibly syphilis contracted during military campaigns abroad. That is medically plausible. It does not explain why the response to his condition required the personal involvement of 2 successive emperors. Standard medical commitment proceedings in the Russian Empire did not require imperial signatures. His did. And here is the detail that does not fit any medical explanation. One of the documented symptoms cited in his commitment proceedings was the wearing of a Russian beard. Beards had been taxed and then banned under Peter I as markers of the old order. Wearing one was not a symptom of any known mental disorder. It was a political statement. It was catalogued as evidence of madness anyway. When a regime classifies a beard as a psychiatric symptom, it is not diagnosing illness, it is diagnosing memory. This investigation does not end with a confession. There is no smoking document. There is no archive that opens to reveal a list of Tartaria rememberers transferred to asylums on direct imperial order. The absence of that document is itself interesting. State archives from the prikaz institutions in the late 18th century were selectively reviewed and reorganized in the 19th century, during a period when the same institutions were acquiring more respectable medical credentials. What remains is a structure, a set of interlocking decisions made by the same people in the same years, pointing in the same direction. The historian who erased Siberia's archival identity also designed the cage. The empress who funded the cage also personally edited the chronicles. The chronicles erased the map. The map was replaced by administrative units whose borders ignored every historical precedent. And the people who lived across those borders, who remembered different names for the same rivers, different authorities for the same land, found that there was now a scientific category available to describe their condition. They were not political prisoners. They were patients. They were not remembering a different country. They were experiencing a disorder. The empire did not need to burn books. It built institutions that reclassified the readers as ill. That system worked for a very long time. The last person personally committed under its logic, Ivan Yakovlevich, left the world in 1861. By then, the institutions had medical staff, published research, professional standards. The cage had grown a respectable face, and the word Tartaria had not appeared on a Russian official map in nearly 70 years. The question worth sitting with is not whether this happened. The question is, what other things, names, territories, arrangements, rights, were reclassified out of existence by the same method, and whether anyone who noticed was still in a position to say so.